In the spring of 1888, a man stepped nervously into the solicitor's office for the Times newspaper. The man was Member of Parliament for Cork City, Charles Stewart Parnell, and he was there to inspect a collection of damning letters the newspaper had recently published. The letters bore his signature and portrayed him as the ringleader behind a brutal political assassination. The problem was that the letters weren't real. They were forgeries. Parnell's mind was heavy with the anxiety these letters had come to bear on him. After all, he had big plans for his country and for himself. The letters could derail all of that. But as he took his first look at them, he breathed a sigh of relief. The letters were rife with spelling errors and handwriting that didn't match his own. In Parnell's mind, the issue of whether or not he could credibly denounce the letters as fake was no longer a concern. His attention now turned to tracking down the forger and exposing them. But who was the culprit? Parnell had a lot of enemies, and any one of them could have conceivably been behind it. The ensuing scandal would not stop at the letters. It branched out into a kind of umbrella scandal that put the country of Ireland on trial while the world watched on with morbid fascination. It was the story of the day, a worldwide event that made front page news in the UK and America. Its resolution came at the cost of countless wasted hours, thousands of pounds, and blood. And we're going to get to the bottom of it. The road that leads to Parnell being accused of complicity in murder is a long one, but each step along the way is necessary in understanding why some people were so ready to believe it. So, this is Ireland in the latter half of the 19th century. Legally it no longer exists as a separate entity, having been folded into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1801. It has been decimated by famine. Over 1 million people have died and 3 million emigrated. Most of the people that remain have no hope of upward mobility. They will most likely work a few acres of land for their entire life, growing just enough food to survive, and paying exorbitant rents to a landlord who they will never meet. They can't make improvements to their home because that will drive up the rent. They can't complain because there's no one to complain to. They are at the mercy of a British government whose negligent policies exacerbated the famine. There are 4 million souls who inhabit the island, and half the land is owned by just 750 families. This situation was intolerable, and it could not stay like this forever. Into this unhappy situation comes Fenianism, the latest form of armed rebellion against the British Empire with the aim of achieving complete independence for Ireland. The chief Fenian organisation was the IRB, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And they, with support from their American sister group Clan na Gael, carried out attacks and bombings on British targets. The most infamous bombing was on the 13th of December 1867, when the IRB blew up Clerkenwell prison in order to free one of their comrades. 12 people were killed, over 100 injured, and no prisoners escaped. The incident caused outrage, and in the months following, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli began cracking down on Fenianism. The incident also changed the form in which Irish autonomy would be attempted. Fenian violence began fading into the background while constitutional methods took centre stage. One man who would assist in this effort was future Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone. Clerkenwell had shocked Gladstone and made him realise that there was an Irish question and it could not be solved by simply ignoring it. He was later quoted as having said, "We are bound to lose Ireland in consequence of years of cruelty, stupidity and misgovernment, and I would rather lose her as a friend than as a foe." A new way was now open in Irish politics, and it manifested itself as the Irish Parliamentary Party, or IPP. It was founded by Isaac Butt in 1874 with the ultimate aim of achieving Home Rule. As a concept, Home Rule meant that Ireland would stay in the UK, but would have its own parliament to manage domestic affairs while answering to Westminster on matters relating to the Empire. While this is obviously not the same as complete independence, it was seen as a desirable and attainable goal. If, for example, famine were to reoccur, there would now be an Irish government to address it directly, as opposed to waiting for an English government who had so badly mismanaged the last famine to drop the ball again. As the new Irish party were beginning to assert themselves, one person who took notice was Charles Stewart Parnell. Parnell's family were members of the Protestant landowning aristocracy. He had grown up in idyllic surroundings at his family's ancestral home in Avondale, County Wicklow. Parnell was educated in some of the finest English schools, and as a young man he enrolled at Cambridge. He was unhappy and unmotivated there, and it was probably at Cambridge that he developed his hostility towards the English ruling class. He was disliked by his peers, and he in turn was contemptuous of them. Later in life he said, "These English despise us because we are Irish, but we must stand up to them. That's the only way to treat the Englishman. Stand up to him." Parnell's time at Cambridge ended when he assaulted a manure dealer who had found Parnell passed out after a night's drinking. Parnell was arrested, the manure dealer pressed charges, and the matter was a great embarrassment for the university. Parnell wasn't kicked out of Cambridge, but he chose to leave anyway and return home to Avondale. A few years later, he was convinced to enter politics. In 1875, he ran as the IPP candidate for Meath and won, taking a seat in Westminster alongside Isaac Butt and the other Home Rulers. As Parnell ascended in the party, he carried up with him a man called Tim Healy. Healy was a barrister and journalist who made many trips to the House of Commons and had slowly ingratiated himself with Parnell. In Parnell, Healy saw a great leader, and Parnell was impressed enough with Healy to make him his secretary. By the late 1870s, the IPP had split into two factions, a moderate faction who remained loyal to Isaac Butt, and a radical faction who were aligned under Parnell. Parnell had recently brought together a massive coalition of Home Rulers and Fenians from the IRB. This new partnership was officially named the Land League. Its goal was emancipation for the poor tenant farmers, to help lower their rents, allow tenants to sell their stake in the land, and to stop arbitrary evictions. The last piece in the puzzle was the leadership of the IPP, which Parnell contested and won in 1880. With the entire Irish political machine behind him, Parnell was off to the races. The landlords had no idea what was in store for them when the Land League got to work in the early 1880s. The League were out to redress the balance between master and tenant, and they had no problem using violence and intimidation to achieve that goal. One of their most effective methods was the policy of complete social ostracization. For example, in Mayo, there was a land agent who had evicted one too many people. When the League heard about this, they instructed the agent's labourers to stop working for him. Next, the agent's servants walked out, and he found himself alone in his house. In the streets, he discovered that no one would talk to him, the shopkeepers wouldn't sell him food, the post office wouldn't deliver his messages, his crops rotted in the field, and the cost of employing outside labourers who would harvest them was 20 times more than the crops were worth. Eventually, the agent gave up the fight and absconded. His name? Charles Boycott, and he left Ireland for good on the 1st of December 1880, unaware that he had just given his name to the English lexicon. While the Land League were duking it out with the landlords in Ireland, Parnell was duking it out with the Liberal and Tory politicians in the House of Commons. Prime Minister Gladstone was seriously alarmed by the actions of the Land League. In response, he drafted a new bill that became known as the Land Act of 1881. The Act gave a lot of concessions to the Irish, most importantly rent control and land courts if a tenant had a dispute with their landlord. However, the Act simply didn't go far enough and would not help the subsistence farmers living in poverty in the west of Ireland. Many people saw it as nothing more than a political stroke to kneecap the Land League. Parnell had to walk a tightrope here. Privately he wanted the legislation to pass, but publicly he had to denounce it, which he did in increasingly vitriolic terms. A new law had made it possible to imprison without trial anyone accused of supporting land agitation. Eventually, Parnell gave an anti-Gladstone speech that was so vicious that he was arrested and imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. For 6 months, Parnell held out for more concessions. While he was in prison, agrarian violence in Ireland reached new heights and the Land League was declared an illegal organisation. In April 1882, Gladstone and Parnell finally reached an agreement. Parnell would put an end to land agitation, all boycotts, acts of intimidation and violence would stop in return for Gladstone cancelling £2 million in outstanding rent. Parnell was released on May 2nd, having achieved the masterstroke of appearing both reasonable to his opponents and uncompromising to his allies. It was a hell of a victory, but Parnell viewed it as just the first step on the road to Home Rule, which he may have achieved if not for a domino effect of events set in motion by a catastrophe that occurred just days after his release. One of the highest executive offices in Ireland was the Chief Secretary. It was essentially the governorship of the country and was subordinate only to the mostly ceremonial Lord Lieutenant. When Parnell was released from prison, the old Chief Secretary William Forster resigned in protest. Gladstone filled the role with the man who had married his niece, named Frederick Cavendish. On the 6th of May 1882, Cavendish arrived at Dunleary Harbour where he was shepherded to his new residence in the Phoenix Park. While he was being driven in a carriage through Dublin City, a stranger had the chance to ask which of the several occupants was Cavendish. When Cavendish introduced himself, the man simply said, "Thank you, that will do," and vanished. Later that evening, Cavendish decided to go on a stroll through the Phoenix Park. During his walk, he bumped into his subordinate, the Undersecretary Thomas Burke. The two men then continued through the park together, chatting about the issues that lay ahead of them. As they approached the centre of the park, they could see a group of men approaching them. As the men got closer, they appeared to be walking in columns. 3 men in the front, 2 men in the middle, and 2 in the back. The first group passed by Cavendish and Burke without incident. The next 2 men passed by as well, and just as the secretaries were about to be clear of the group entirely, the 2 men who had just passed them by spun around and took out knives. The attack didn't last long, and soon afterwards Frederick Cavendish and Thomas Burke lay dead from multiple stab wounds. The Phoenix Park murders had been carried out by a secret group within the IRB called the Invincibles. Politically, they were a disaster, and they were all the excuse the government needed for a fresh crackdown on Irish nationalism. Parnell denounced the murders, but from then on his name became synonymous with violence and crime in the minds of his enemies. Tim Healy was so despondent that he believed the cause lost for a generation and that they should all resign. The murders were also one of the causes of a split in the Liberal Party. When Parnell and Gladstone tried to enact Home Rule, Spencer Cavendish, the older brother of Frederick, broke away to form the Liberal Unionists. In 1886, the Home Rule Bill was defeated in the House of Commons when the Liberal Unionists joined with the Conservatives in voting against it. During these years, Parnell's personal life had become an increasingly delicate balancing act. He'd been acquainted with a former army captain named William O'Shea. O'Shea liked to throw dinner parties and had invited Parnell many times, but Parnell had always found an excuse not to go. So O'Shea's wife Catherine made it her mission to pin down Parnell and get him to accept an invitation. She called for him at Westminster, and when Parnell came out to meet her, she was immediately taken with him, and he was instantly taken with her. After just a brief conversation, he happily agreed to attend the next dinner party. As she was leaving, a rose Catherine was wearing in her bodice slipped out and fell to the ground. Parnell picked up the rose, kissed it, and placed it in the buttonhole of his jacket. Sometime later, they entered into an affair. Although it was an affair in name only, because Catherine and her husband were estranged. They'd been living apart for years and had only been keeping up appearances at social events. Catherine filled a void in Parnell's life. He'd always been a very reserved man, but with her he could share his deepest thoughts, hopes, and fears. The two of them grew deeply in love. They lived together and eventually had children together. In a practical sense, they were man and wife. But this was Victorian England, and adultery was among the most severe social transgressions a person could commit. This meant that for the sake of Parnell's career, and for the sake of Catherine's reputation, it was crucial that their love life remained a secret. O'Shea was completely aware of the affair, and gradually he even came to accept it. Parnell was conciliatory towards him, and for a time the three players maintained a tense but stable equilibrium. In 1886, Parnell got O'Shea elected as an MP for Galway in direct opposition to the wishes of the IPP. This drove a wedge between Parnell and Tim Healy. Healy detested O'Shea, and privately he and the other members scoffed at Parnell for putting his sordid personal life above the will of the party. Healy even committed a mutiny when he and another member called Joe Bigger came down to Galway to personally denounce O'Shea. 4 months later, disaster struck when the Pall Mall Gazette revealed that Parnell had been living with Catherine at her home in Eltham. O'Shea was mortified. He had been happy to enjoy the fruits of his wife's affair, but not at the cost of his honour. Sensing this scandal could be weaponised against him, O'Shea left politics for good, and from that day on, he considered Parnell his mortal enemy. One morning in early 1887, Parnell sat down with Catherine at the breakfast table and opened up the latest issue of the Times. The paper had been publishing a series of articles called Parnellism and Crime, which alleged the Land League was a criminal organisation bent on political anarchy that murdered opponents and intimidated everyone else into compliance. The negative publicity certainly wasn't desirable, but the articles up until that point hadn't caused too much of a stir. Really, it seemed like things were going to continue on like normal. But on this morning, the Times returned with a bombshell piece of evidence to back up its claims. In between bites of marmalade toast, Parnell had the surreal experience of reading an incriminating letter attributed to himself that he never wrote. 15th of May, 1882. Dear Sir, I am not surprised at your friend's anger, but he and you should know that to denounce the murders was the only course open to us. To do that promptly was plainly, thoroughly our best policy. But you can tell him, and all others concerned, that though I regret the accident of Lord Cavendish's death, I cannot refuse to admit that Burke got no more than his deserts. You are at liberty to show him and others whom you can trust, but let not my address be known. He can write to the House of Commons. Yours truly, Charles S. Parnell. The Phoenix Park murders had come back to haunt Parnell, this time in the form of a forged letter which showed him condoning the most infamous assassination of the time. Parnell's only recourse was to denounce the letter as fake in the House of Commons. He didn't get that chance until 1 o'clock in the morning after a lengthy bill reading had ended. By that point, the people he needed to convince, the Conservative and Unionist politicians, didn't much care what he had to say. The letter was confirmation of everything they had ever suspected about Parnell. Things got even worse later on when the Times published another batch of forged letters, this time from Parnell and former IRB man and party treasurer Patrick Egan. These letters appeared to show them not only condoning, but orchestrating and paying for the Phoenix Park murders. In a letter from Egan to a member of the Invincibles named James Carey, Egan supposedly wrote, "I have by this post sent M £200. When will you undertake to get to work and give us value for our money?" A letter from Parnell to Egan had Parnell saying, "Dear E, what are these fellows waiting for? Let there be an end to this hesitancy. You undertook to make it hot for Forster and Co. Let us have some evidence of your power to do so." Parnell knew he had the fight of a lifetime ahead of him, and he set his sights on the man who he believed was behind the forgeries, Captain William O'Shea. When Parnell told the other League members he suspected O'Shea, they were unconvinced. Patrick Egan didn't think that O'Shea was capable of such an underhanded act, even if he had the motive. So Egan began conducting his own investigation. A few years earlier, he had exchanged letters with the owner of a newspaper business he had been trying to buy. When Egan compared the older letters to the letters in the Times, he grew suspicious. He noticed similar handwriting and identical misspellings in both correspondences. Not only that, but entire phrases from the Egan letters were also present in the Parnell letters. It was as if someone had used the former as a base from which to forge the latter. Egan concluded that the man he corresponded with years ago and the writer of the Parnell letters were one and the same. That man was Richard Pigott. Richard Pigott's background is so obscure that I can't even say for sure when or where he was born, though by the time he was a child, he and his family were living in poverty in a small house in Dublin City. His father worked for a paper called The Nation, and it was here that Pigott got his start in journalism, sweeping the floors of the newspaper office. When he was a young man, Pigott moved to Belfast to work for a struggling paper called The Ulsterman. It was during these early days that Pigott developed a reputation for a lifestyle that should have been beyond his means. He bought expensive gifts for women he courted, he dined at the finest restaurants, all supposedly with the money he earned from his entry-level newspaper job. Pigott even loaned money to his often indebted employer, which led to rumours that Pigott was embezzling funds from the company and then loaning his boss's own money right back to him. In the late 1850s, Pigott convinced his employer on a complete rebrand of the Ulsterman. The office was moved to Dublin, where it was renamed the Irishman, and Pigott was promoted to manager. Under Pigott, the paper adopted a firebrand nationalist character. He charmed the IRB enough to be allowed into their inner circle, and soon he was fully involved in the Fenian movement. Pigott bigged them up in the Irishman with headlines like, "Recruits for the Revolutionary Army, hundreds of thousands of dollars poured into the Fenian exchequer." In the old days, the Irishman had been a bland paper on the verge of bankruptcy, but as the voice of Fenianism, the money started to roll in. Unfortunately though for Pigott, the wheel never stops turning, and the good times were not meant to last. It started when Pigott tied his fortunes to the fortunes of Fenianism. He had bought the Irishman outright and was continuing to make money hand over fist, but after a failed rebellion in 1867, an instance like the Clerkenwell bombing, the desire for an armed Irish uprising began to lose its potency. As Pigott looked around himself, he saw a changing world. Old Fenians like James Stephens and O'Donovan Rossa had been exiled, their part in the nationalist cause over forever. In their place were parliamentarians like Isaac Butt and an upstart named Charles Stewart Parnell. Even the IRB had changed course by getting in bed with the Parnellites, and there was a new word on everyone's lips, something called Home Rule. Pigott was a man out of time. The Irishman began to rapidly decline in sales, and Pigott took to borrowing money. He needed a new tactic to drum up interest in the paper, and he decided on a complete course reversal. The Irishman adopted a conservative pro-government stance. Pigott railed against the Land League to the point where Patrick Egan, tired of the negative press, made an offer to buy the paper on behalf of Parnell. Pigott had failed to rebuild his readership, so reluctantly he agreed to sell. At the last minute though, he pulled a fast one and cancelled the sale immediately after receiving payment. Egan tried the purchase again, this time holding back on payment until every last legal formality had been finalised. The sale was eventually completed, but Pigott was left bitter and resentful. He claimed the land league had leaned on his moneylenders, and the lenders had in turn leaned on him. Regardless though, the money from the sale wouldn't last forever, and soon Pigott would need to find a new source of income. Pigott lived in Dunleary with his wife, children and 2 sisters. He adored his family, he showered his children with presents, and made sure all his loved ones had the best life the money could buy. The family loved to entertain guests, and it was said that whenever you called to the Pigott household, the decanter was always on the table. But with his income greatly reduced, it became clear to Pigott that their way of life was unsustainable. Searching for a new way to earn cash, Pigott found what he was looking for when he was introduced to Edward Caulfield Euston. Euston was the secretary for the Irish Loyal and Patriotic Union, which was a political group set up to oppose Home Rule and keep Ireland a part of the UK. Euston adamantly believed in a connection between Parnellism and Fenian violence, and he was looking for any evidence he could get to prove it. In July 1886, Pigott told Euston that he had made an incredible discovery in Paris and that Euston must set sail at once to meet him there. They met in a room in the Hotel du Monde. When Euston arrived, he saw a mysterious black bag lying on the bed. Pigott told him that in this bag was incriminating evidence against the Parnellites, including damning letters written by Parnell himself. He said that he had been given these letters by 2 Fenians who were downstairs waiting for payment. All Pigott needed from Euston was £500 to pay the Fenians, plus £150 as a finder's fee, and the letters were his. Not wanting to miss out on the bargain of a lifetime, Euston jumped at the chance. Afterwards, he gave the letters to the Times, and that is how the infamous letters came to be printed in a major newspaper. And now, the fallout. Parnell wanted the House of Commons to appoint a committee to determine if the allegations against him were genuine. Instead, they went way further than that. The government set up the Parnell Commission, a judicial inquiry with a broad mandate to look not only into the allegations against Parnell, but the whole of the Land League and the IPP. There were 3 main things the commission was to investigate. Did the defendants want to achieve complete independence for Ireland? Did the defendants want to bring down the landlord system? And did the defendants use violence to achieve these goals? The British government was essentially putting Irish nationalism on trial. 65 Irish members of Parliament were accused of crimes, along with various members of the Land League. The prosecution's goal was to expose a criminal conspiracy of murder and treason among every nationalist organisation. And at the heart of the inquiry was the case of Parnell versus the Times. The whole reason the commission was set up in the first place was because certain people believed so wholeheartedly in the letters. Everything depended on their validity. The prosecution desperately needed to prove they were genuine, and the defence desperately needed to prove they were fake. The Parnell Commission swept through politics like a flood, and everyone needed to choose a side to stand on before they got swept along with it. Gladstone wanted to stand up for Parnell, but he was advised against doing this. The Liberal Party rushing to Parnell's defence would have been bad for optics, so reluctantly Gladstone agreed to stay neutral. Even though he felt this was a great injustice to Parnell, the Irish Party would get no open support from their Liberal allies. Meanwhile, Parnell had drafted future Chief Justice of England Sir Charles Russell as his counsel. Russell had a razor-sharp mind and a savage command of the English language. There wasn't a more formidable person Parnell could have picked to defend him. Tim Healy was also preparing to aid in the defence of his colleagues, but Parnell stopped him in his tracks. He refused to allow Healy to provide legal counsel for anyone except himself. Healy was dumbfounded and angry over this. A mutual friend later said that Parnell's decision was retribution for Healy's mutiny in Galway. Of everyone who needed to get out of the way of the flood, there was no one more vulnerable than Richard Pigott. In October 1888, he was tricked into coming to the house of a Liberal MP named Henry Labouchere. When Pigott arrived at the house, he was brought into the sitting room where he was confronted by Parnell himself, along with Labouchere and a solicitor named George Lewis. Pigott, facing immense pressure from the 3 men, broke down and admitted the letters were his forgeries. Labouchere offered Pigott £1,000 for the letters that Patrick Egan had exchanged with him years earlier. Pigott agreed to think about it and left. Both sides committed tactical blunders here. In reality, Pigott had destroyed the Egan letters long ago, ruining the only chance he had left to escape the ordeal with some cash. Labouchere's mistake was in offering money at all, because now the prosecution could claim that the defence had offered their star witness a bribe. Pigott met with Labouchere again in December. This time Pigott admitted he no longer had the Egan letters, at which point Labouchere lost interest and broke off all communication. Pigott, feeling the walls close in around him, wrote to one of the solicitors for the Times and begged not to be subpoenaed, but the solicitor would hear none of it and insisted that Pigott testify at the commission. This was unsurprisingly followed up with a subpoena from the Parnell side. The flood was approaching, and Pigott, caught in a trap of his own making, could only watch as it came closer. No matter what he did from this point on, he would be taking his place on the witness stand. The Parnell Commission opened on the 22nd of October 1888. It featured an all-star lineup of judges, counsels and witnesses. The courtroom was jam-packed with spectators and journalists. The first 6 days were taken up with opening speeches and establishing the basics of the case. The opening statement from Richard Webster, the solicitor for the Times, concluded that Parnell was fully aware of the violence committed by his compatriots and could have stopped them at any time. Parnell was often absent or late during these early days of the commission. This was attributed to him simply having more important things to do. But few people knew at the time that Parnell was suffering from kidney disease, which was beginning to eat into his day-to-day life. Still, this didn't stop Parnell from arriving 15 minutes early on the 6th day of the trial, because on that day, Richard Webster was about to produce his first star witness. The crowd, giddy with anticipation, watched as Captain William O'Shea took his place on the witness stand. Parnell, normally so calm and collected, was visibly seething with rage as he stared across the courtroom at O'Shea. O'Shea's testimony was strange and not particularly helpful to the prosecution. He said that he had been the intermediary between Parnell and Gladstone when Parnell was imprisoned in Kilmainham jail. According to O'Shea, Parnell had agreed to end all unlawful action in return for the Arrears Act that cancelled £2 million in outstanding rent, thus supposedly confirming Webster's opening statement that Parnell knew all about the violence that was going on. This was more or less the sum of Webster's examination of O'Shea. Now, Charles Russell got his first crack at cross-examination. He asked O'Shea about his relationship with Parnell. O'Shea said they had been on friendly terms until the spring of 1886, when certain things came to my knowledge at the time which destroyed the good opinion I'd hitherto held of Mr. Parnell. I imagine this obvious reference to the love triangle between him, Parnell and Catherine had the few people who knew about it holding their breath. This was an incredibly dangerous route for the defence to go down. The truth of Parnell and Catherine's relationship had been mostly suppressed, but if O'Shea elaborated any further, the results could be disastrous. To the relief of everyone involved though, Russell quickly abandoned this line of questioning. Russell asked O'Shea if he thought the Parnell letter in the Times was real. O'Shea bizarrely responded, "I did not think it was genuine, but I thought the signature was." O'Shea's meandering testimony didn't really help anyone, and soon afterwards he was excused. Next up on the witness list was Edward Caulfield Houston, who was cross-examined by Charles Russell. "Where did Pigott get the letters?" Russell asked Houston. Houston talked about how he had paid Pigott £1 a day to travel around the world and collect incriminating documents against the Land League and IPP. Houston and Pigott had written back and forth during this period, but unfortunately for the defence, Houston had burned these letters a mere 2 months before the trial was set to begin. He said he didn't want to leave any clue that could be traced back to the origin of the Parnell letters. He didn't even consult with his solicitor before he destroyed potentially vital evidence. According to Houston, Pigott's sworn affidavit that the letters weren't forgeries was all the assurance he needed. Russell asked Houston if destroying the letters was fair to Parnell. Houston paused, then turned his eyes upward and said, "I do not think Mr. Parnell entitled to any consideration." A few questions later, and Houston's first day on the witness stand came to an end. The next day on February 20th, Charles Russell resumed his cross-examination of Houston. Russell asked Houston to recount, step by step, the story of the black bag full of incriminating letters. Houston told the same story that Pigott had told him, that a black bag full of letters had been found in a room that had once been occupied by one of the Phoenix Park murderers. That bag had subsequently been moved to Paris by a group of displaced Fenians. Russell asked Houston if at any point did he stop to test any of these statements about the black bag. He had not. Houston said the existence of the letters matched up with what he was reading about Parnell in the papers. Russell asked Houston exactly what event that was published in the media had convinced Houston of the credibility of the letters. Again, he had no answer. Houston had no answer for every question that related to the black bag and its journey from the room of a Phoenix Park assassin to a hotel room in Paris. He had never made any inquiry into where the room was, what street it was on, how the bag had been taken to Paris, or who had found it in Paris. All he knew was that Pigott was aware of its contents. The conversation now shifted to the events in the Paris hotel where Pigott had supposedly purchased the bag from two mysterious men downstairs. Russell asked Houston if at any point he snuck downstairs to see who exactly it was that Pigott was trading with. Houston said no. No, responded Russell with amusement. No. Did Houston ever ask who the men downstairs were? The response was once again no. Houston had deliberately built a brick wall between himself and any detailed knowledge of the letters. If he knew nothing, then he could reveal nothing. And he had cemented this brick wall by destroying every written piece of evidence that detailed the transaction between him and Pigott. Houston's testimony was now finished, and it was time for the star of the show to take his place on the witness stand. The audience looked around the room excitedly for their first glimpse of Richard Pigott. After an awkward delay, an usher appeared, elbowing people out of his way. Behind him walked the man who had been the centre of so much controversy. He was first examined by the Times counsel Richard Webster, who asked him to recall how the letters had come into his possession. Pigott told an incredibly long, convoluted story that had him travelling the world in search of the letters. Webster then asked Pigott about his meeting with Henry Labouchere and Parnell. Pigott gave his own demented version of the story in which Labouchere begged Pigott to say the letters were fake. In this version, Labouchere told Pigott that if he discredited the letters, he would become so popular that he could be elected to Parliament. Or, if Pigott wished, Labouchere would whisk him away to America, where he would be greeted by a torchlight procession from Clan na Gael. Pigott said that Labouchere had even offered him £1,000, but Pigott, paragon of virtue that he was, turned him down. The idea that Pigott had a shot of being elected to Parliament, or that he would be given a hero's welcome by Clan na Gael, had the courtroom in hysterics. Even Labouchere himself joined in the fun. The only person who wasn't laughing was Pigott, because it was time for his cross-examination, and he was about to be placed under the toughest scrutiny of his life. Charles Russell bolted out of his chair, marched over to Pigott, and handed him a sheet of paper. "Mr. Pigott," he said, "would you be good enough, with my lord's permission, to write some words on that sheet of paper for me?" The words were livelihood, likelihood, proselytism, Patrick Egan, and hesitancy. Pigott wrote the words, and then he stared at Russell, and Russell stared back at him. "Have you ever had correspondence with the Archbishop Walsh?" asked Russell. This was a surprise question for Pigott. Yes, a few months earlier he had written back and forth with the Archbishop of Dublin, William Walsh, but Pigott was under the impression these letters were protected by a confessional seal. Charles Russell was under no such impression, and he laughed when Pigott tried to claim this. Russell asked if the letters to Walsh referred to an incriminatory matter regarding Parnell. Pigott hummed and hawed for about 2 minutes before finally answering yes. Did the matter include the letters in the Times? Yes, said Pigott. Russell then read Pigott's letter to Walsh out loud. In the letter, Pigott mentioned upcoming proceedings which would destroy Parnell's influence. Russell wanted to know what exactly were these proceedings. Pigott couldn't say. Russell asked, did Pigott not write to Walsh and say that Parnell would be accused of having participated in a crime and that criminal proceedings may follow? Pigott again was non-committal, so Russell pressed further. Did Pigott not tell Walsh that he was in a position to get Parnell out from under all of this? Yes, responded Pigott. How could you do that if the letters were not forgeries? Pigott stopped dead in his tracks. Russell pressed him for an answer. If the letters were genuine, what mechanism would Pigott have to save Parnell? I can't think, stammered Pigott. You must try, insisted Russell. I can't think. Try. I really can't give any explanation. Russell then directed Pigott's attention to the most damning part of the letter. In the PS, Pigott had told Walsh that if he really considered Parnell guilty, he would have never bothered the Archbishop. Pigott's explanation for this made absolutely no sense. He claimed he must have had some other secret about Parnell in his mind when he wrote to the Archbishop Walsh, but he couldn't remember what that secret was or who had told him or where he had heard it. The secret is hermetically sealed in your bosom? No, replied Pigott. It has flown out of my bosom. The courtroom erupted into laughter once again. Even the judges were laughing. Even Pigott was laughing. A nervous, shifting kind of laughter. This brought an end to Pigott's first day on the witness stand. His testimony was a complete disaster for both himself and the Times. Pigott's clear admission of guilt to the Archbishop of Dublin made him the prime suspect for the forgeries, and the next day the courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see how much deeper he could dig himself. The next day, Russell produced the letters that Pigott and Patrick Egan exchanged back when Egan was trying to buy the Irishman. Russell brought attention to the striking similarities between the genuine Egan letters and the forged letters that had appeared in the Times. For example, in the Times letter dated 11th of March 1882, there was the phrase, "Dear Sir, as I understand your letter which reached me today." Well, this exact wording appeared in the letter that Egan had sent Pigott on the 19th of May 1881. Next, Russell compared one of the forged Parnell letters to a genuine letter he had sent Pigott during Pigott's negotiations with Egan. In the real letter, Parnell wrote, "Dear Sir, in reply to yours of this date, I am sure you will feel that I will always be anxious to do what I can for you, but I could not consent to the conditions of the purchase being your constant employment on the paper." This was similar to the Times letter dated June 16, 1882, in which Parnell supposedly wrote, "Dear Sir, I shall always be anxious to have the goodwill of your friends, but why do they impugn my motives? I could not consent to the conditions they would impose." Pigott had no explanation for any of these coincidences. He tried to laugh it off and even admitted that the similarities were remarkable, bordering on improbable. Russell wasn't anywhere near finished though, and after making Pigott sweat, he sprung the trap on him that he had set at the beginning of the examination. "Among the words you wrote down yesterday at my request is the word hesitancy," said Russell. "Well, you spelt it as it is not ordinarily spelt." "Yes, I fancy I made a mistake in spelling it," Pigott responded. "What was the mistake?" "I used an A instead of an E." No, I mean, well, I'm not sure what the mistake was." "I'll tell you what was wrong," said Russell. "You spelt it with an E instead of an A." A wave of excitement came over the courtroom. Everyone knew that in the Times letter dated January 9th, 1881, there appeared the same misspelling, Hesitency, hesitancy. Pigott's explanation was desperate, panicked, and again made no sense. He claimed that he had seen the misspelling in the Times and it must have gotten into his head. But, as Russell pointed out, Pigott had been spelling hesitancy wrong for a long time, evidenced by a letter of his which also contained the misspelling that was dated June 1881, 6 years before the Parnell letters ever appeared in the Times. At 4 o'clock, the court adjourned for the weekend, and Pigott shuffled out of the witness box, utterly defeated and devastated. The crowd was buzzing with enthusiasm. It had been a riveting day for them. There had been laughs, there had been surprises, and they couldn't wait to see what would happen when court resumed after the weekend. There was a general feeling that the evidence against Pigott was so insurmountable that he was sure to confess. All the major players were in the courtroom on Tuesday the 26th of February to see the big moment. Everything was set to begin, and all eyes turned towards the doorway from which Pigott was about to make his grand entrance. They looked, and waited, and waited, and waited. Then a murmur rose in the room. Richard Webster anxiously conferred with his junior counsel, after which Webster rose and announced to the court that Pigott had not been seen since 11 o'clock the night before. Pigott, sensing the end drawing near, had pulled a runner. Charles Russell was furious. "Behind Euston and Pigott, there is a foul conspiracy," he shouted, banging his fist off the bench to emphasize the word conspiracy. Russell then revealed that 3 days earlier, Pigott had visited Henry Labouchere for a third time and once again made a full confession. But then Pigott's solicitor told the court that after he made this confession, Pigott came to him and retracted most of what he confessed to. Regardless of this confessional flip-flopping, an arrest warrant was issued that day for Richard Pigott. The following day, a letter sent by Pigott to his solicitor was read aloud in court. It was Pigott's original confession to Labouchere. It read, "I, Richard Pigott, am desirous of making a statement before Henry Labouchere." Pigott then proceeded to reveal how he concocted the entire story about how the letters came into his possession. When he came to the topic of how he carried out the forgeries, he wrote, "I picked out words and phrases to secure the proper handwriting. I traced some of the words by placing the letter to the window and drawing them onto a piece of tissue paper, and thus I procured the signatures." After Pigott's confession was read out, Richard Webster stood up and denied the authenticity of the Times letters. And with that capitulation, the case for the Times against Charles Stewart Parnell collapsed. But the story was far from over. Pigott was wanted by the police, but nobody had the slightest clue where he was. His disappearance made the headlines, and in London especially, wanted fugitive Richard Pigott was the talk of the town. Richard Randall, a celebrated music hall performer, unveiled a new ditty about Pigott that Friday. It went, "Oh where is this little pig gone? Oh where can he be? Oh why did he trot and spoof up the lot and leave the poor Times up a tree?" Where indeed? Pigott had been sequestered at the Andertons Hotel under the watch of 3 police officers, which should have made it impossible for him to escape. So let's rewind the clock back to Monday 25th of February 1889 and see how he did it. Between 3 and 4 a.m, one of the police officers saw Pigott leaving the hotel to go post some letters. Once he was out of sight, Pigott simply kept walking until he had completely escaped captivity. He returned to his house in Dunleary, where he gathered up some expensive books. He sold these books at Sotheby's and then used this cash to travel to France. From France he travelled to Madrid, where he checked into a hotel under the name Ronald Ponsonby. Pigott then spent the next 2 days taking in the sights. He hired an interpreter and toured the city, visiting museums and art galleries. By the evening of the second day, Pigott was low on cash. He tried to pull a swindle on a Spanish bank by drawing a bogus cheque for a large amount. When this didn't work, he telegrammed his solicitor asking for money. The solicitor told the police in London, who alerted the police in Madrid. When Pigott got back to his hotel room, they were waiting for him. They silently followed him up the stairs, and seconds after he retired to his room, there was a knock at the door. When Pigott answered the door, there were several police officers there to arrest him. What Pigott said next has varied depending on who was telling the story. He may have asked permission to shave, he may have said something about his luggage. Either way, he was given a few seconds leave, and that was all the time he needed. He moved towards his bag and pulled out a pistol. An officer lunged forward, but it was too late. Pigott put the gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. Richard Pigott is usually portrayed as a vile, nefarious con artist, and not undeservedly so. He was a liar, a fraud, he betrayed the nationalist cause for money, but even in the most contemptuous writings about the man, you can still see some of his finer qualities. His generosity, his love for his children. Maybe, if he had stuck by his original confession and not gone back on it at the last second, history would have remembered him a little better. But unfortunately for Pigott, he fell at the last hurdle, and now he lay dead on the floor of a hotel room in Madrid. In the words of the Times, a horribly mutilated corpse. In total, the Parnell Commission lasted 128 days. It was described as an entire history of a people. It covered the land issue in excruciating detail, how the land coalesced into the hands of a few British families, what had changed since the Land League was established. There were farmers, landlords, priests, Fenians, journalists, and all manner of people who testified. In the end, it all amounted to very little. In the report submitted by the Commission, several League members were found guilty of trying to bring about a united Ireland. The problem was that the central evidence against the Parnellites was so discredited that it made the rest of the findings a sort of fruit of the poisonous tree. The report was simply accepted by the government, and it didn't pursue any further action. When Parnell next entered the House of Commons, Gladstone gave him a standing ovation, and was soon joined by the rest of the House. Parnell had come out of the Commission smelling like roses. His popularity was at an all-time high, and he was eager to once again fight for Home Rule. On December 18, 1890, Parnell met with Gladstone at his home in Harden Castle to begin preliminary discussions on the next Home Rule Bill. Parnell made a great impression on Gladstone, and he talked publicly about how happy he was with Gladstone's terms. For the first time in a long time, the future looked very bright. 6 days later, on Christmas Eve, William O'Shea filed for divorce, and the love triangle between Parnell, Catherine and O'Shea became public knowledge. The timing of the divorce was due to the death of Catherine's great-aunt Ben. Ben had left Catherine her entire fortune in her will, with the stipulation that Catherine live within a strict moral code. O'Shea, hoping to inherit a piece of the fortune, wanted to show how Catherine had supposedly not lived up to these standards, thus invalidating the will. The divorce proceedings lasted 2 days, in which Parnell's secret life was laid bare for the world to see. O'Shea was granted a divorce decree and custody of all children under the age of 16, including Parnell's 2 daughters that he had fathered with Catherine. The anti-Parnell media had a field day with the scandal, and even some of the allies began to wonder if Parnell simply attracted too much controversy. After Parnell blew off an emissary of Gladstone who wanted to relay the Prime Minister's concerns, Gladstone had a letter published in which he called on Parnell to resign as leader of the party. Parnell in response published a scathing manifesto in which he accused Gladstone of trying to override the independent decision-making of the IPP and ridiculed Gladstone's vision for Home Rule. This manifesto was a disastrous miscalculation by Parnell. If Gladstone's terms for Home Rule were so unsatisfactory, then why had Parnell spoken publicly about the great progress he was making? In the minds of the party members, either Parnell had lied about the version of Home Rule that was on the table, or he had gladly accepted awful terms. This conflict caused a split down the middle of the IPP, and for 6 grueling, exhausting days, they debated what to do about Parnell. Tim Healy, after having a strained relationship with Parnell for so many years, had finally endured one too many scandals. He launched a vicious attack at Parnell, claiming he had outlived his usefulness to the movement, and railed at Parnell over what he perceived as duplicity in his Gladstone manifesto. Either Mr. Parnell was false or his manifesto was false, said Healy. Parnell was incandescent with rage, and he reminded Healy that he owed his career to Parnell. While both men raged at each other during the day, they were emotionally beaten at night, and privately they longed for it all to be over. In a letter to his wife, Healy wrote, "I am worn out with anxiety. There is nothing going on but lobbying and intrigue." On the fifth night, Healy went to see Parnell and asked him to submit to a simple vote on his leadership. Parnell agreed to sleep in it, but the next morning when Healy went back to see him, Parnell said he would refuse to resign regardless of any vote. He did though reassure Healy that there wasn't a gun in his pocket, as he had heard Healy was worried about this. Later that day, when a member tried to pass around a paper motion for Parnell's termination, Parnell snatched it out of his hand, shouting, "I will not receive it." Things got so heated that when somebody made a quip about Gladstone being the master of the Irish party, Tim Healy responded, "Who was the mistress of the party?" referring to Catherine. When Healy's friends saw how furious Parnell was, they formed a wall between the two men. And I wonder if at this moment, Parnell wished he had that gun on him. Finally, when it was clear that no resolution could be reached, more than half the members walked out for good. The United Irish Parliamentary Party under Charles Stewart Parnell was over forever. Parnell limped on as the leader of the divided party for another year, but his kidney disease was seriously taking a hold of him. Every month he looked paler and sicker. One day he gave a speech in the pouring rain, and by the time he got home, he couldn't walk up the stairs by himself. Catherine helped him up the steps and put him to bed, and he never came back down. In the decades that followed, the spirit of Irish nationalism changed dramatically. The Irish Parliamentary Party was swallowed by Sinn Féin, the IRB was superseded by the IRA, and the battle fought by Parnell to save his reputation became a memory, then a distant memory, then a chapter in a history book.